Warning: this video contains images and sequences of gratuitous violence, as well as violence against civilians.
Get over here! Get over here!
For decades, violence in video games have been a source of tension in American culture. From Death Race to Mortal Kombat to the Call of Duty series, violence in video games has gone from being scrutinized to there being calls for games to be outright banned from American society. In contrast, on the other side of the Pacific, Japan exists as another society that is thoroughly steeped in violent video games. The country has produced such titles as Ninja Gaiden, Bloodborne, and the Yakuza series. Yet calls for changing or banning games, while present, are less frequent and have not produced anything to rival the moral panics of the United States. Why is this? Among the many cultural differences between the US and Japan, one stands out against the rest. In the post-World War II era, the slow societal embrace of violence and imperialism throughout and after the Cold War in America contrasts with Japan's embrace of pacifism and rejection of imperialism, as laid out in Article 9 of the Constitution of Japan, adopted in 1947. These different cultural underpinnings existed during the rise of the video game industry in each country and, to an extent, still exist today. As a result, big-name American games tended toward being centered around realistic militarism and/or general violence, while big-name Japanese games did not tend toward military themes and, while they are plenty violent, they lean more towards fantastical violence rather than realistic violence. Yet there is one Japanese game franchise, and one instance from one game in that franchise, that embodies both countries' cultural trends: the final boss fight in Metal Gear Solid 3, Snake Eater. Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater is a stealth action game created by Hideo Kojima and published by Konami. The player takes on the role of Naked Snake, an American Special Forces soldier tasked with killing his mentor, the Boss, who has defected to the Soviet Union in order to prevent an international incident between the US and the USSR during the Cold War. Mechanically, the game presents the player with different enemy types and multiple ways to interact with them. Unlike most action games, Snake Eater gives the player the option to eliminate enemies non-lethally and rewards the player for being a pacifist. Snake Eater's establishment of both a pacifist system of play, as well as rewards for engaging with said system, is a design choice that has been prevalent in the series since Metal Gear. The pacifist system also runs parallel to the portrayal of the Boss throughout the game. In every cutscene she is present or mentioned in, the Boss is revered as the greatest soldier to ever live, yet at the same time, she never kills anyone, including Snake, even though she gets the opportunity twice. In contrast, even if the player chooses to engage in Snake Eater's pacifist system of play, Snake is surrounded by death in the cutscenes he is in. Other boss fights in the game end with that boss's death in a cutscene, even if the player performs the fight non-lethally. The physical portrayal of the Boss and Snake contrast as well. In most of her scenes, the Boss is covered in a black poncho, though underneath it she wears a white military outfit. The color white is associated with peace throughout different cultures, especially in relation to war. In contrast, Snake wears darker military colors and, more notably, an eye patch near the end of the game due to his eye getting shot out after being captured and tortured. As a result, Snake emerges as not only the more violent of the two characters, but also as a victim of his own violence, represented by his lost eye. With this framing, the game builds to the final confrontation between the two, the pacifist versus the warrior. Or, more subtly, Japanese cultural pacifism versus American cultural militarism. The final fight in Snake Eater begins with a cutscene. In it, Snake confronts the Boss in a field of white lilies, another signifier of the peaceful and pacifistic nature of her character. Snake asks her why she is doing everything that she is doing, to which she responds, quote, "to make the world whole again." The Boss proceeds to enter a long monologue, explaining to Snake how she developed her views that led to her acting the way that she did throughout the game. She expresses how, with each significant moment of her life, she saw the fruitless nature of the conflict portrayed throughout the Cold War. The arms race and her experience with nuclear weapons, she says, quote, turned her blood white, another nod to her connection to the color white. Her experience in the space race made her realize it was just another competition between the US and the USSR. When she is sent to space, she looks down on Earth and sees what she calls a, quote, world without borders, and she commits herself to achieving that reality. The monologue covers a lot, but it plainly reveals the boss's evolution from soldier to pacifist. Most importantly, she expresses how, despite society's thinking otherwise, there is no, quote, timeless enemy in the world. She states, quote, our enemies are human beings like us. They can only be our enemies in relative terms. This statement is the primary connection between Snake Eater and the historical and hysterical moral panics in society. Moral panics only exist relative to the times they are happening. As time goes on, that which society panics over becomes ingrained in society. The subject of a moral panic changes easily and conveniently for those inciting the panic, and the cycle continues. These same cycles exist in all forms of conflict, and the boss, an established representative of pacifism, understands this. Snake Eater builds the boss and Snake as opposing forces, but allows the player to understand the boss's point of view by letting them engage in the pacifist system of play throughout the game. Snake Eater forms its primary antagonist and protagonist into representatives of pacifism and violence and, by extension, representatives of Japanese and American cultures, colliding in the game's final boss battle. The boss fight itself is very different from most boss fights in games. There is no music, no fanfare, just Snake and the boss in the field of white lilies. The player has access to every weapon they have gathered up to this point and can engage the boss as they see fit. Most notably during the fight is when the player or the boss damage each other, the white lilies they are fighting in get stained by blood, a representation of the violence staining the peaceful location of their fight. The player can defeat the boss lethally or non-lethally, but regardless of the outcome, a cutscene occurs where Snake walks up to the boss who lies wounded on the ground. She expresses to Snake that he is a wonderful man, gives him her gun, and then asks him to kill her. Snake takes the gun and points it down at the boss. The game then gives an audio cue that indicates that the player is now in control of what is happening, meaning that they must pull the trigger and kill the boss. The player has no other ways to interact with the game, and no matter how long they wait, the game will not continue unless they shoot. This moment is Snake Eater's thesis on violence in games. It is an acknowledgement that violence in games, to a certain extent, is a necessity. Yet at the same time, it rejects the notion that violence must be at a game's center. The player is not rewarded for the violence they are forced to commit, outside of letting the game continue, and neither is Snake, since he is crushed that he must kill his mentor. It rejects the hyper-violence of American military games, while at the same time acknowledging that the pacifistic elements of modern Japanese culture can only extend so far in certain spaces. It attempts to quell the fears of violence in games by presenting to its audience a typical macho military man who is subsequently broken down by the violence that surrounds him instead of embracing it, with the final nail in the coffin that holds his beliefs being the bullet he fires to kill his mentor. It shows the horrors of violence and the pain it causes, and attempts to show people that not only does violence in games not change people for the worse, but it can actually be used as a teaching device to make people understand that violence is not the answer, even if it is the only option. After delivering the final blow to his mentor, Snake watches as the white lilies that surround her turn blood red. He stares up into a storm brewing in the sky, as both he and the player come to terms with what they have just done.